Adam Smith, an intellectual giant, his name has come to be reflexively associated with the idea of the invisible hand in free markets. Staunch proponents of the free markets have claimed Smith as their ideological patron saint. Under his banner, they advocate for completely unsupervised markets as the ideal economic arrangements, in optimizing both material outcomes and freedom. Government intervention is never welcome, for markets always know best. Such a viewpoint was notably revitalized in the mid-20th century by the highly influential Chicago School of Economics and subsequently imposed upon the Third World in the form of neoliberal structural adjustment policies by the International Monetary Fund. One can readily hear political pundits, or even high school teachers and college professors brand themselves as Adam Smith guys as they tout the perfection of the markets. However, what did Smith really believe? It would seem people spend far more time worshipping him than actually reading him. In fact, an examination of his actual ideas reveals a far more nuanced picture than popular culture would suggest, and fundamentally challenges the dogmatic position on markets held by commentators across the political spectrum today. Smith is best well known for his theories on the efficiency of free markets and the prosperity that results from individuals rationally pursuing their self-interest. To obtain a better grasp of his ideas, though, it is important that we review what his underlying ethical concerns were, the specific problems he noted with Britain's pre-capitalist society, and how he believed markets would address them. The overarching issue he identified with society was his observation that all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. In his day, these principal architects of policy were the merchants and manufacturers whose interests had been so carefully attended to. Having the ear of government, they were able to establish legally enforced monopolies, hence ensuring higher profits at the expense of the public. Smith also recognized that capitalists could privately conspire to take over the markets, remarking, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices." Another major problem Smith identified was the superior bargaining position granted to capitalists over workers, hence driving wages down. In his words, "It is not difficult to foresee which of the two parties, workers and masters, must have the advantage, and force the other into a compliance with their terms. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and the law besides authorizes their combinations, while it prohibits those of the workmen." A remedy to these problems was to encourage competition through the free markets, where government's interference in, say, subsidizing manufacturers or enforcing monopolies would be eliminated. Competition would keep businesses honest and reduce prices to their natural levels. Furthermore, because capitalists would have to compete directly with one another for workers, wages would naturally be bid up, which was certainly desirable, as Smith regarded the workers as representing society's interests. After all, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater parts of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. Another ancillary benefit of higher wages was that the quality of labor would also increase. Where wages are high, accordingly, we shall always find the workmen more active, diligent, and expeditious than where they are low. On the other hand, Smith was highly critical of profits, which he saw as coming into direct conflict with wages. If a corporation pays lower wages, it has higher profits, and vice versa. In Smith's own words, profit is always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin. As Michael Goodwin explains in his book Economics, the forgotten message of the wealth of nations is, "Beware the capitalists, those who live by profits." In Smith's words, the proposal of any new law which comes from capitalists ought never to be adopted till after having been examined with the most suspicious attention. It comes from an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public. Smith's observations are highly relevant in our contemporary society, but unfortunately have been distorted into scandalously simple-minded dogma. Markets always know best. The modern age's masters of mankind are monolithic financial institutions and transnational corporations which dominate governments and dictate policy. As John Dewey put it, politics is the shadow cast by big business. Conservatives and liberals alike have become servants in the interest of big business, advocating they be freed from the shackles of governmental regulation, while supporting them in their fierce campaign against working people and labor unions, all in the name of unleashing the wealth of the free markets. The concerted, often violent campaign to dismantle labor unions in recent years is of especial concern. Recall one of Smith's primary desiderata: increasing worker wages by leveling the competitive playing field between capitalists and workers. However, bargaining power has radically shifted in favor of the capitalists since this time. With the advent of industrialization, industries rapidly increased in size. The phenomena of economies of scale meant that just a couple of owners of a steel plant could employ hundreds of workers. Capitalists dramatically took the upper hand in wage negotiations, as hundreds of workers would now have to bargain with just one boss. Hence, despite the considerable benefits to people's lives one would expect from industrialization, history presents a not-so-rosy picture, with factory workers often toiling 18-hour workdays for dirt-cheap pay in horrendous conditions which still persist in much of the Third World. The structure of the economic system, driven by Smith's maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for others, naturally resulted in conditions Smith surely would have denounced. A key solution to rectifying this pay disparity is for working people to organize in labor unions. By functioning as a collective unit, they can increase their bargaining power and gain equal footing with the capitalists. However, corporate America, and particularly conservatives, have waged a bitter assault against labor unions, condemning them as perversions of the free market system while pressing for increased state subsidies to corporations and import protections. In fact, America has an unusually violent labor history among industrialized countries. Think of the Red Scare or Reagan's overt subversion of worker rights protected in international treaties. In her review of the history of American labor, Patricia Sexton reports an estimate of 700 strikers killed and thousands injured from 1877 to 1968, while in comparison, one British striker was killed since 1911. Today, corporate profit margins are at an all-time high. Collectively, they have over $2 trillion on their balance sheets. At the same time, however, despite all that growth, real worker wages continue to stagnate at 1970 levels. Yet, you would never hear Smith's apostles quoting, "Profit is always highest in the countries which are going fastest to ruin." What these market ideologues seem to miss in their passionate denunciation of governments as the scorn of freedom is that power can accumulate in more than just one form. Transnational corporations are enormous, unprecedented concentrations of private power, which possess a near-totalitarian grip on economic life. Yet, these ideologues, with their tunnel-like vision, are only able to focus on the threats of government, while ignoring the corporate barbarians at the gates. Incidentally, it should be noted that the American free market system lauded by ideologues is largely a myth. We have always had a state-driven form of capitalism. As Noam Chomsky often notes, the Pentagon system of industrial subsidy and planning is responsible for major developments in the economy, such as commercial airplanes and even the internet, industries worth billions of dollars today. The state has also played a critical role in redirecting public funds to prop up private corporations. A 1995 study by Winfried Ruergrog and Rob Van Tolder of the 100 biggest corporations on the Fortune list found that at least 20% flat out would not have survived were it not for government's bailouts. In a true free market system, those corporations would be left to fail. And if these corporations, along with our financial institutions, really were too big to fail, then our economy clearly has profoundly drifted away from the free market paradigm of Smith's time, which may have applied to his pre-capitalist society. So, when political pundits argue against labor unions as distorting our free markets, yet support welfare for corporations and banks, their arguments really don't make much sense. At least on the specific issue of unionization, we can be certain of what Smith's stance would have been when he remarked, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater parts of the members are poor and miserable." This issue of wages, profits, and bargaining power, I believe, is perhaps the most important lesson to draw from the wealth of nations. However, there are a couple of additional points I would also like to underscore. The first is his stance on division of labor. Smith proponents often cite his explanation of the potential of labor to vastly increase the productive capacity of society. Smith references the example of a pin-making factory in which the various components of a pin have been divided among a multitude of workers to enhance efficiency. However, few ever bring up the more important points that Smith makes a couple hundred pages later. Namely, that a man who devotes his life to mechanically producing the 19th part of a pin will become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Well, that's obviously an undesirable result, so the implication is that governments would need to take measures from allowing division of labor from proceeding to its extremes and establish education standards to prevent brain-dead people. After all, you have to ask yourself what the markets are for in the first place. To optimize human welfare, but welfare means much, much more than simply churning out endless goods for consumption. There are other dimensions to human dignity and value that must be considered when examining what the market should accomplish. The second point is the usage of the term invisible hand, Smith's best known phrase. Today, we understand it as meaning the social benefits of individuals acting in their self-interest. However, it is worth looking at how exactly Smith used the phrase. Throughout the entirety of The Wealth of Nations, it only makes a single appearance in the following passage. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. The invisible hand was really an argument for why what is now called neoliberal globalization would be prevented. Let's break it down. Smith's claim that self-interest would be channeled into societal interest rests upon the critical assumption that individuals would prefer the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, that they would conduct business and invest domestically rather than abroad. In the preceding paragraphs, he explains why. In the home trade, his capital is never so long out of his sight as it frequently is in the foreign trade of consumption. He can know better the character and situation of the persons whom he trusts, and if he should happen to be deceived, he knows better the laws of the country from which he must seek redress. In other words, people have a home bias. They prefer the familiarity of their country's customs, in Smith's words. However, this assumption has been utterly torn apart in our modern age of prolific outsourcing, offshoring, and transnational capital flows. The third and final auxiliary point I would like to emphasize is Smith's criticism of corporations, which is especially interesting in light of the tremendous influence they exert over modern society. As a quick background, Investopedia defines corporations as legal entities separate and distinct from its owners. The owners or shareholders elect a board of directors who appoints the managers of the corporation. In Smith's time, the primary corporations were the joint stock companies, the main example being the Dutch East India Company. He wrote, "The directors of such joint stock companies, however, being the managers rather of other people's money than of their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own. Negligence and profusion, therefore, must always prevail, more or less in the management of the affairs of such a company. Appointed directors would be more concerned with their own personal gain rather than the long-term welfare of their company as a private owner would. In fact, many of these corporations, being rather cumbersome arrangements, existed only through the exclusive privileges granted to them, such as legal monopolies. Smith hoped that competition through laissez-faire policies would kill them off, but clearly that hasn't quite happened. As a basic matter of justice, it does not do to selectively filter and contort Smith's ideas for the convenience of easy explanation. Forgotten are his ethical considerations in advocating for free market policies. Ultimately, he sought to improve the conditions of the working class and expose the rapacity and plunder of the masters of mankind. Free markets were not an end in themselves, but rather a means to bring about tangible improvements in the lives of the general populace. The myth of Smith continues to hold a high place in the temple of the Western intellectual tradition. It is up to us to dispel that myth.